Hey kids, howdy and welcome. It is time once again for Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. That's me. I am your host. I'm here with producer Zoe, and we are talking about the week of October 30th through November 5th. It's a kind of a quiet-ish week, but we are just fresh out of eclipse season with the eclipse over the weekend. So we're really still feeling the amplified energy of that. It's going to be an extra spooky Halloween here in the United States because we're really just coming off that incredible energy. It's actually going to be a little bit of a shorter episode this week because it's the 5th Monday in the month of October. And every time we have 5 Mondays in a month, I bring on a guest. And unfortunately, the guest that we had scheduled for this month is somebody whose work sometimes requires that at a moment's notice they are drawn off to attend something like the birth of a baby. So hopefully that guest will return in the future, but in the meantime, we had to do a slightly abridged version. So we've got all the juicy astrology for you. We're going to skip an astro question for the week, and we don't have a dream interpretation segment, but we got all the astrology worthy of talking about. So wormhole, not wormhole, eclipse season, not eclipse season. Let me sort of talk about that a little bit, because in some ways, because the second of our 2 eclipses happened on Saturday, that we're done. We're done with eclipse season. We're done with the wormhole. And that is both true and not true, depending on how you want to look at it. So this idea of a wormhole, or describing the period of time in between eclipses as a wormhole, came from one of my astrology teachers, Stephanie Azaria. I'm pretty sure she's the only other person that I sort of heard that idea of 20, 25, 30 years ago when I first was studying astrology. And in quantum physics, a wormhole is the idea that a particle could move from one place in the universe to another place in the universe instantaneously by kind of traveling through a way in which the fabric of time and space would fold in on itself. Then there's this idea that's a theory in quantum physics that you could move to a impossibly other place in the universe. And of course, you've seen this as a special effect in movies, that sort of swirling tunnel of light a la Stargate, where you fall in and suddenly, everybody's on the other side of the universe. And so what I like about using the term wormhole to describe the period between eclipses is that we are the particle in that equation. We are changed so radically by the fated quality of eclipse seasons that we really do come out the other side different, or at least that's the theory. So I have always referred to the wormhole as specifically the time between eclipses, because my experience in my little body says that those weeks are extra, they're amplified, they're intense, worthy of the phrase wormhole. But eclipse seasons vary in their structure. This one has 2, and it started with a new moon and then a full moon. But not all eclipse seasons are equal. Some eclipse seasons have 2 and start with a full moon and then a new moon. Some eclipse seasons have 3. As many as 4 can happen, depending on the angles of the whole sort of system. So the new moon solar eclipse 2 weeks ago was followed by the full moon lunar eclipse on Saturday. So we are still inside the lunar cycle that is an eclipse season. So no more eclipses ahead of us, but we're still in the lunar cycle that started with an eclipse and had an eclipse in the midpoint over this past weekend. So the next 2 weeks is still intense. It's still a kind of wormhole because a lunar cycle sort of exists as a cyclical whole.
That's interesting.
Right? So we're still in it. So I would say there's like really 2 messages that are equally so. One is it's a little bit easier because both eclipses are behind us, but we're still in a rock'em sock'em lunar cycle driven by Venus, right? The new moon in Libra was ruled by Venus. Saturday's full moon in Taurus, ruled by Venus. So everything that happens in these next 2 weeks as we wrap up this lunar cycle is still going to be about releasing blockages to our hearts that inhibit a better giving and receiving of love experience. In fact, I'll add this as just a kind of something that happens this week is that we are going to be moving through the 3rd quarter moon on Sunday. So that means the lunar cycle officially ends 1 week after that. So when we meet next week, kids, I'll be talking about the last week of the lunar cycle and the completion of the entire wormhole. But understand that the 3rd quarter moon is always a crisis moment in the lunar cycle.
Right.
And as is the 1st quarter. The 1st quarter is the crisis of thriving, failing. You plant a seed in the ground, and then a week later, seeds are either going to crack open and germinate or crack open and die. And the full moon is the harvest of the benefit. That was this past weekend. And next Sunday, in the 3rd quarter moon, we are tested to have to deliver into our experience our greater wisdom that we've learned over the last 3 weeks. That's the idea of that. What's the crisis? In the 1st quarter is like, I don't know if this is going to work. Then in the 3rd quarter of the moon, the crisis is, well, now that we know it's going to work, how can I share that wisdom with the world? That's Sunday. And because it's a crisis moment in the lunar cycle and it's an eclipse lunar cycle, the weekend up ahead could be a little bit stressful as a result. We are in Scorpio season, so everything's a little bit more intense. The sun is in the mansion of death and rebirth, inching towards the darkety dark of the, winter solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere. It's, spooky season and pumpkin spice season, and tomorrow's Halloween in the United States. So it's it is the season of the intensity of the Scorpio mansion because of the sun's movement through this mansion. But we've also got Mars and Mercury in Scorpio as well. And they're all hanging out together close enough to be a bona fide stellium. Stellium is just a word that means more than 2. 2 planets together is a conjunction. 3 is a stellium. It just is a cute word that means 3 or more. And in this case, it's our conscious awareness, the sun, Mercury, our perceptions and our minds and our conversation and our voices, and Mars, decision-making, approach to goals and ambitions and actions, and even the physical body. When Mars is in Scorpio, we're up for an intense time. We're more willing and ready to dive into change and transformation because the body, ruled by Mars, or reflected by Mars would probably be a more accurate way of saying it, in this mansion says, I'm down for change and transformation. I'll die to self more readily when the planet that rules my physical actions and decision-making is in a territory that says death and rebirth is the way to go. And because Mercury is there, we are perceiving things more deeply, willing to have more powerful conversations that are more authentic and revealing, because Scorpio is the house of secrets. And so having Sun, Mars, Mercury all together in this mansion means that we're in a potentiality of deep change if we allow it, if we're willing to surrender to things that are maybe scary and vulnerable to surrender to, but that's how change and transformation takes place. So all three of these folks are gathering in Scorpio, and they're going to do some interesting dances this week with Chiron, and then next week with Uranus and Neptune. So next week, all three of them are going to oppose Uranus and trine Neptune. So we're moving next week into some territory where some sudden shifts are going to come our way, oppose Uranus. That's like out of the blue, anything can happen and probably will. The trine to Neptune allows us to approach those pivots and sudden demands to shift and change by just being supported by our spiritual connection. So that's a dynamic setup for next week, which of course I will talk more about in next week's episode. What's happening this week, though, is a perfect precursor to that, because all three, Sun, Mars, and Mercury, are going to be holding the great eliminator angle with Chiron this week.
Sun, Mars, and Mercury. Okay.
Yeah, so conscious awareness, action and choices, voice and perception are all going to be staring down the barrel with the great healer of Chiron saying, "Are you ready to let that fucking shit go at long last?" Right, so we've been up to deep healings all year. Venus has been wildly active for months. It's an eclipse season. That's a south node eclipse, which means letting go of the past. We hold so tightly to the past because in our fearful places, we feel like our very life and safety depends upon holding on to that which we're familiar with and comfortable with. And sometimes that just keeps us stuck in the wounded patterns. So this week, there is opportunity all week long to be aware of our wounded spaces and what we're letting go of. The awareness comes from Chiron. From the sun. We are ready to talk about it differently and perceive our capacity to do some deep healings and letting things go because Mercury is touching in with Chiron in this way. And then because Mars is doing it, that means that our bodies can follow suit by behaving in different ways that come from being in healed spaces rather than wounded spaces inside our little bodies. And Mars will say, okay, finally. I'm reminded of that story. I walked down the street, I fell into the hole. I walked down the street the next day and I tried to sideswipe the hole and I fell in anyway. The third day, I blah, 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 fell in. And, this week, it's finally the story of I took another street.
Got it. So we make new choices this time.
Yeah, we make new choices or we're preparing to be able to make new choices from higher healed spaces in our psyche. And the more we do that this week, the more we consciously see and become aware of the patterns we're releasing and able to sort of operate from a higher place, the things we're able to sort of grok about that this week will pay dividends next week when we're confronted with sudden, unexpected stuff that causes us to have to shift. And hopefully the shifts that next week brings in that last week of this crazy lunar cycle that is an eclipse wormhole, that we're able to make choices and pivot reactions from a more healed place because this week we let some things die. This is not a powerful year for what we call triple transits in major planetary movement. If you've been following astrology for a while, you know that 2020, which was sort of the kickoff to the new world we live in, was marked by wild, big, and powerful transits between the social and the outer planets. Last year, in 2022, we were sort of still dealing with, Saturn and Uranus in a square, lots of big, chunky geometry. This year, that's not the case. Now, this has been an uncomfortable year of incredible amounts of change and shift, But because the big honk in geometry is slimmer, we're all having experiences that are much more individual, right? When there's big geometry, there's more collective responses to that. Hence 2020, like a perfect example of, Saturn and Pluto coming together. That's big geometry. And, everything changed on the world for everybody kind of in the same way at the same time. So we're not quite in the same kind of year. Next year will be similar. Not a lot of big sweeping either transits from planets or movement of planets from one sign to another. Now that changes in 2025 and 2026 when, Neptune will change signs, Uranus will change signs, Saturn will change signs, right? So we're still in a period of time where smaller energies are dictating the collective experience. And I think all of you are going to get this, especially because it's about the second half of this year. Jupiter and Neptune have been in a semi-square since late July and then again this coming weekend. This is a mild agitation. A semi-square is a half a square, A square is the most combative geometry that we work with in astrology. It's the angle of the fight, right? So I always use the floor and the wall, right? So that you guys get the square, and the fight can't win. Like nobody can win that fight, right? Or the house falls down. So a semi-square is half that, a mild conflict and obstacle sensibility. Now, the shadow of Neptune is confusion, lack of clarity, missing things, being deceived by things that you just don't have the reality check yet. Now, Jupiter is thought to only bring, air quotes, good things. He's the planet of expansion and abundance and prosperity. But he has a shadow as well, which is extra, over the top, overvaluing things, thinking you're all that in a bag of chips to find out, oh, fuck, there's more to explore. So put these two energies together in mild conflict geometry, then they're both going to express the shadows that they carry. So this is a transit of vulnerability, lack of direction, not knowing what's going to happen next. Jupiter is about our expansion. We kind of always want to know what's going to happen next when Jupiter's in town because it's what we're creating that we desire more of. But this transit says, I can't see that. I can't know it. So the best way for me to sort of convey how this is playing out is just think current events. Think current events here in the United States. If you were looking at the news right now, especially what's happening in Congress, we really just don't know what's going to happen next. Everything is confused and confusing. So now remember that current events, just like astrology, is all just a projection. And the confusion that's being carried in some current events is also happening inside all of our collective psyche. All of us this year, especially since the summer, are carrying this bit of we're moving forward because life moves forward, but holy shit, I don't know where we're going. I can't quite figure out what's going to happen next. I feel like things are potentially expanding, but I got the blinders on. I can't know what's going to happen. And none of us can feel quite relaxed because of this sense of uncertainty. Remember, it's mild. I'm even just thinking about my own year of what I'm trying to accomplish in my business and, retooling how I present certain teaching. Like there's things I'm working on that are about my expansion, expanding my business, but they're not clear and concise. And I'm changing my mind a couple of times. And, every once in a while, my team will be like, hey, kids, this may change. So, right. So I can see how that's playing out in my business, right? So your job, listeners, is to understand that we're still in a little bit of a tunnel of cloudiness, confusion, the potential of overvaluing things and not quite knowing what's going to happen next, which might be leaving us vulnerable, especially in a way that amplified over the summer and will continue through this month and into next month because of this last hit of this transit that peaks over the weekend. And not for nothing, there might be some real bona fide, like, confusing events that rise up over the weekend as this transit peaks. When in doubt, remember that there's a part of you that absolutely knows what to do next, even if the 3D pedestrian mind of you doesn't. And that's, Neptune still rules our spiritual connection. So when in doubt, you close an eye or two, put a hand in your heart, one on your belly, take a nice deep breath and say, I don't know where I'm going next, but I know there's a part of me that does. And I lean into that part now, trusting my own unfolding. And so it is. Have at it.
Thank you for listening to Conscious Embodiment, Astrology and Dreams with Dr. Michael Lennox. You can find us on Apple Music, the iHeartRadio app, and anywhere you find your favorite shows. Head on over to michaellennox.com for information on astrology readings, the daily Astro Alert subscription, upcoming classes, and to join the mailing list.